Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the virtual Craft Distilling Expo and our panel today, which is sustainability in distilling. It's something that I've been very keen on for a long time, and at the Expo, we've been trying to get more topics that involve areas of green distilling and sustainability. And of course, we're going to have a eco packaging panel, which is a huge part. As for a long time, it's been forgotten about, but is actually increasingly awareness is building on that. But today we're talking more about the distillery side of things, which is still really, really vast. It is not just solar panels and windmills. So without much more ado, we've got a great selection of people to speak to. Probably many people will be familiar with our panelists already, but let's start and let them introduce themselves. And Chris, if you want to kick off, please.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris, and I'm the co-founder of Cooper King Distillery. So we are a self-built, crowd-funded distillery just outside of York, producing sustainable spirits underpinned by craftsmanship, honesty, and adventure. And very quickly, it was born out of an adventure. Abby and I head to Australia about 6 years ago. We quit our jobs, bought one-way tickets, met the people who made the world's best whiskey, absolutely fell in love with distillation, and came back and cracked on. That's us in a nutshell.
Brilliant. Russ?
Nice. I'm Russ Wakeham and co-founder of Two Drifters Distillery. So we're the world's first rum distillery with a carbon negative footprint. It's a labour of love as well. It's my wife and I, Jaume. We set up the distillery about 18 months ago now. Really just keen to get on with this panel. It's good stuff.
Marvin. Will?
I think I'm the only one whose wife is sensible enough to leave the crazy dream to one person. Yeah. But I'm Will, and I run Greensand Distillery here in Kent. Set up to try and be a bit of a groundbreaking distillery. So everything we do goes through a kind of lens of sustainability. And a big part of that is exclusively distilling with things which would otherwise go to waste. And I think we're now up to seven spirits made from exclusively waste or byproducts. So yeah, that's us.
Exciting, and we should definitely come on to that shortly. So we'll start off with the straightforward, the obvious thing that people think of when they think of green and environmental and sustainable things, which is energy and sources of energy. So if we kick off with Russ, if anyone else, if either Will or Chris, you want to jump in afterwards, but let's start off with Russ and let's go from there.
Yeah, great, thanks. So the energy side of things, energy is easily the biggest cost that you've got to face as a distillery. It really depends how you want to power your stills. And I don't actually know how you guys power your stills. Are they electric? Are they steam driven?
Yeah, electric.
Yeah, nice. So electric gives you the option of choosing to use renewables. So you can choose that from general suppliers, SSE, whatever your supplier is. They generally do a green tariff. They'll do something which will only run on renewables, and you can cut out CO2 emissions from our perspective. That's what we care about most of all. So that allows that option. But obviously, we all dream of being a big distillery. I guess there's maybe a limit for everyone, but you dream of being huge and taking over the world. But there comes a point where electricity is really limited in terms of how big the still can be, and you do need to think about how to decarbonize larger stills. So certainly the Scottish whiskey distillery industry is fully run on fossil fuels, really. And there's probably a real big discussion to be had about how we look for alternatives. So certainly it's easy for smaller craft distillers to look at renewable energies, but the answer is not obvious for how to remove fossil fuels from larger distilleries. And I guess I just wanted to put that out there as we will maybe have a chat about what other options there are. I mean, for me, the one that I really want to push after is kind of a hydrogen-based distillery. So if you could think of hydrogen as the fuel, instead of burning fossil fuels, the byproduct's water. But of course, you've got to make your hydrogen. And so, it's really interesting thoughts around that. Yeah.
Chris, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, good point about Russ, about sourcing green energy and choosing a green tariff. I guess anyone looking to go down that route as well, it's worth noting that there's some providers that are 100% green, so all of their energy network is green, and there's some that will give you a green tariff, which is sort of 5% of what they do, and 95% is burning fossil fuel. So I guess I'm sure this will come out the next 45 minutes, that all these decisions, there's so many. I mean, you can make the first one. I think, like Russ said, they encourage you to make that first one green energy tariff, but then you can always go a step further, I guess, and just be aware there's other impacts of the provider versus purely the tariff. And again, we'll come onto it later, I guess, but just reducing your use in the first place, I guess, is the number one driver behind all of this. So you could power your stills, your distillery, using any fantastic innovative means, and there are more. There's a big government funded grant at the moment happening to find new ways of powering distilleries. But I guess at the end of the day, you've got to try and reduce that use in the first place and get that as low as possible, as I know you two guys have. I've looked at a few reports, they're superb. Yeah, it's my input on that, I think.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree with the other guys that making sure you've got a really efficient setup. And I mean, stills like the modern stills, I think anyone setting up a distillery these days will have fairly efficient setup. You go from a still like ours, which is probably 400 liters. It's the smaller end of a craft distillery. You go bigger than that, and you need to have an electric steam boiler. Bigger than that, just as Russ said, you're getting into carbon territory. So I think at the moment, your options, if you want to be really green, are bio LPG, which is literally just coming on stream in Europe, biodiesel, or wood chips. So there's a couple of distilleries in the UK using wood chip boilers, and wood chips are quite an energy dense form of fuel and reasonably environmentally friendly. Biodiesel is an option. I know Silent Pool use biodiesel for their larger stills now, and I think that's a reasonably good system. And one thing we haven't talked about is energy recovery, which I think is absolutely critical. So just here next to our still, you can see a white tank kind of through in the less sexy looking room. That is actually full of yesterday's second distillation of stillage. So the hot waste coming out of the still is sitting in that tank. Now, we're not distilling today because I had to go and see the supplier, but tomorrow, the next wash, which will be a waste bread whiskey, will come through that tank, pick up the heat, go into the still, and it will go from a fermentation temp of about 12 degrees, which it is in this distillery pretty much all year, and it'll get straight up to about 50 degrees just from that waste energy. And that saves about 15% of all our distilling energy input, just that process. And we built this ourselves for about £1,000 or thereabouts. So it's absolutely easy to build these systems.
I think that kind of fits into what Chris was saying about reducing stuff in the first place. Having that recovery means that there's going to be less of an input in that. Any other thoughts on energy recovery on that sort of subject?
Just a small one, and I don't know whether we come across it later, but about obviously you were recovering the heat from distillation process, but then the cooling water as well, which I guess was all built into your system. That's exactly what you're doing. But yeah, having closed loop cooling systems, so you're reducing your use of water as well, and then capturing that energy. And I guess as well, for anyone starting out, you can, for some, it can be quite daunting, I guess, if you want to start a distillery, like, I'm going to get myself some stills and crack on, and then you realize there's these whole extra layers of things to build in. So I guess it's being aware from the beginning that, you could get your stills, you could start, but then have a plan to bring in those technologies. And like Will said, they're simple and they're affordable, but be prepared to put in the work and the research up front.
Need to be a plumber or hire one.
I think that probably, thank you for the segue, Chris, leads us on to the subject of water, which, most of the time in the UK, we do all right with how much water we have. Okay, occasionally there's droughts and things like that, but it is going to be an increasingly scarce resource. And there's water, it's a key part of distillation, and there's waste there. So Will, do you want to tell us a little bit more about your approach towards water and wastewater and that kind of thing, please?
Yeah, I mean, as we aim to be zero waste. We want to be zero chemical, zero plastic, and zero waste as part of our, and as part of zero waste, we consider water as part of that. And that's a little bit of a non-traditional approach. And it's non-traditional because water is such a cheap resource. We really don't value it. But we want to kind of minimize waste in all parts of our system. And so we can, a distillery like ours, through this condenser here, we'll just, we put like 1,000, 2,000 liters of water a day. So first of all, you've got to be in the mindset of valuing water as a commodity itself. And then a distillery like ours, we use a lot of water. That's full stop. So what do you do to limit that? Now we've gone down one route, and I know Chris has gone down another route that we were considering, which I'm excited to hear about. But the route that we went down was to build a cooling pond. So all of the water, the hot water coming out of our still, first goes through a heat exchanger, which you can't see here. So we've got a big thermal store. The hot water will go through that, heat up that water, and that water powers our hot water use in the distillery. So we're catching as much water use, hot energy from it as we can, but then we need to drop it right down in temperature so that it can cool our stills again. And we've built a wildlife pond that contains a couple of heat exchangers in it to really drop that right down to below kind of, ambient temperature, down to groundwater temperature. And it's a little bit of an experiment. I have to say that we're gonna run it for a year and then write it up as a research project, because I want to understand, did the carbon intensity that went into building that pond, does that even make sense over the long term? Should we have just gone down Chris's route or another route? So it's a little bit of a thumb in the air, but I think the basis of all of this should be like any resource you put into a distillery, value it and then treat it like precious commodity.
Chris?
Yeah, so all our gin is distilled under vacuum, so on rotary evaporators. So these are very energy efficient pieces of equipment normally found in laboratories. There's a few of us in the country distilling using them. So the cooling side of that, the condensers are actually, they're a closed loop chiller unit. So they run on a food safe glycol. And that is just recycled and chilled with a small electric chiller. It's about 1 kilowatt in power, so there's not much at all. And we've calculated, we've got 2 of these stills, and if we were using just mains water, we'd be running about 13,000 litres of water a year in our current production on there. So having 2 of these things, we're saving 13,000 litres of water a year per still, which for a small distillery is a fair bit. But it's an expensive way of doing it. And like Will said, you've got to kind of work out how much these things cost, the carbon intensity of it, review it for a set period, and then come back and say, well, was that worth it financially? And was it worth it, with the carbon saving? But yeah, we've found them to be fantastic and very economical to run.
Russ, you got any thoughts on what's the setup for you for your water and that?
Yeah, interesting. Ours is probably a large scale version of the roto evaporators. So instead of being under vacuum, ours are general stills that you heat up, but the cooling system is a closed loop. I'm just in the process. We're upgrading to the glycol system as well, but currently runs on water that's chilled by another glycol circuit, right? So they're not linked. So we have the legacy that we were a brewery at the start. So we have a lot of brewing equipment left in, which gives us a cold water tank that's jacketed with this glycol solution. That's then in a closed loop through, we've got 6 small stills and 1 larger still, and they're all linked to the same circuit. So you can send it into whichever one you want at whatever time. But that allows us to do a lot of things. And one is that we fill that tank with the water that we then end up, so it warms up by cooling the stills, that then warms up to the correct point that, and I guess this links to the energy stuff that we were talking about earlier, but basically it goes to the temperature that we start the next fermentation at, right? So it heats up. Ours are at 30. So we heat ours back up to 30, and then that's ready to go mixed with our molasses on for making the next fermentation, right? But beyond that, we then cool the waste distillate from the first stuff. So we use the water that's in that cold tank that goes through a heat exchanger, heats up the water for the cleaning vessels, cleaning all the vessels behind, right, while the waste goes out at room temperature. So yeah, we have a closed system. We try and get 3 or 4 uses out of every litre of water before it eventually ends up in the product, right? Because most of our product is water. So yeah, it's crucial. It's the most important ingredient. The only thing I'd say about water for us is we do a lot of purification as well. So reverse osmosis system, UV sterilization, all that sort of stuff. And yeah, that's kind of, it's just a really important ingredient to think about.
What I love about all these systems is I know that all of us have these fantastic diagrams which really explain it much better than words can.
Yeah.
We've all tried, but
So
we
much
know
easier
that
in
it's sitting in
person
a
to show it as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you buy an off-the-shelf distilling kit, you end up like heating something in one place, cooling something in another place, needing something hot over there, something cold over there, and it's just a complete madness. So thinking about that and tying it all together is important.
Good design.
So this is a kind of a curveball question, but so what that seems to suggest to me is that part of the approach to being more sustainable as distillers, you have to think about this like really, really early on, and it has to be part of your plan from the start. Like retrofitting this stuff doesn't seem like it's going to be something that's going to be very easy to do. Doable, but it seems a lot easier to think about it to start with. Would that be a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I'd say 100%. So I was an architect in a previous life, and with if you design stuff well in the first place and put the money and time up front to get it right, it's much more efficient and much more pleasant for everyone involved going through. If you start retrofitting or with houses, start moving walls once they're already built, it's not fun for anyone.
Yeah, I mean, you got to kind of, I do think that's the ideal. Hopefully this will be watched by a lot of people who want to get into distilling, and either don't have the money to do it all up front, or think they do and find out at some point in the process that they don't. For me, I've got like a hierarchy of wants around sustainability, and just like Russ was saying, think about the big stuff. And I did another talk recently, saying, well, all of this stuff, taking plastic off our bottles, taking plastic straws out of our events, all that kind of stuff is great, but it's kind of window dressing when you compare it with burning oil and burning gas and using all this water. So if you're doing all that cool stuff, then think about these big questions. So, if you're setting up a distillery and you're just like, you don't want to buy another still 6 months in when you start thinking about sustainability. So you do have to think about some of this stuff. But we added for example, the heat exchanger probably 2 years in, and we've added the cooling pond 4 years in. So some of this stuff we're bolting on, and we just didn't have the money to do it all at the beginning.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Well, so then we'll move on to having done the energy and the water. Actually, need to ferment something if we're going to be making. I know everyone here is doing distilling from the fermentation as well, aren't you? So that's great as well. So sustainable inputs. Where do you get this stuff from? What's the carbon impact of these different products that you're bringing in to make your spirits? Well.
So for me, there's a couple of important things. And the first is that, like a lot of things, for me, it's about being a journey of building relationships. When we go to the status quo in working with surplus produce, which is what we want to do, is, we've got huge pack houses, for example, that they pay to get rid of the fermentable produce that we could use, but they're happy to do that because they don't want 100 people turning up with like a trailer to load up. So the status quo in the food industry is just don't think about it, don't deal with it. So definitely for me, it's been a journey of building personal relationships with people within the food system to take them on the journey, to get them to understand what we're trying to do in this distillery and get them to buy into it. And then they're kind of willing to work with you a little bit. I do think in this industry, we've lost a little bit of a connection of why we distill in the first place. In a lot of the history of distilling is about using the produce which you couldn't eat or couldn't sell or couldn't keep. And certainly, within Central Europe, there's a real strong connection with that still. But we've kind of, I think, certainly in this country, we've lost it for various reasons. So my aim with our distillery here is to use all this wonderful surplus or reject produce and make really fine spirits with it. And it's definitely not the easy thing to do, and it's not the cheap thing to do. It's not the clean thing to do. But I kind of have this belief that it's the right thing to do. So we make we've only released 2 of our fruit brandies, but we actually make 4 fruit brandies. We make a whiskey from waste bread, and we make you can argue that rum is a waste or a byproduct spirit at least. So, you know, within the food system, not to bang on about it because it's something I'm really deeply passionate about. If there's a problem in the food system, it always ends up at the farmer's door, and the farmers always have to pay. And that's not necessarily anyone's fault. It's just the way our food system has been structured. So if we can pay farmers for something that they would otherwise lose or go to waste, then that's great from my point of view.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts from anyone else?
Yeah, just Will obviously touched on a great point there, that it's not cheap and not easy, and I think that probably underpins all three of our efforts in the why we're distilling it. We're not doing it the cheap or easy way. It's because we believe the way we're doing it will make a difference. So for us, instead of using waste produce, we partner with local farmers. So we distill whiskey and gin here. The barley we use in the whiskey is grown 7 miles away. It's a heritage grain. The farmers are paid a set or a very good price for that grain to grow that specifically for us to be floor malted and turn into whiskey. And again, what Will touched on is, I guess Will was talking about engaging with suppliers, but also engaging with consumers. If you can begin to champion terroir, so, you know, spirits being a product of the location, the environment in which they're distilled, and you can talk about the barley, where it's grown, the farmers you're working with, and communicate that to the sort of end consumer, it just becomes a really wholesome process and allows people to understand, like Will said, why we distilled in the first place and what the process is. And actually you start with a raw material. And, you know, about a month ago, I fulfilled a childhood dream and went up to getting a combine harvester with a farmer and harvest our barley. Absolutely beautiful, joyous process. And that's the very beginning. So yeah, it's a very wholesome way of doing business. And I guess supports English growers as well. If you can source barley and stuff and grains from local farmers, then it does support our economy, which is something definitely to be championed.
And I think, like you were saying, it does seem to be something that people increasingly care about. And part of it is people certainly it's one of the things I like about some of these fruit brandies and that, is I think, well, this would go to waste otherwise, and it's really tasty, so this is brilliant. But then also, if you have a distillery in a location, and particularly if people are as proud about where they live as people are in Yorkshire, of course, great fight there. They're going to want, it's Yorkshire barley, so much the best for that. And so I think it can be something that's a real force for good, it sounds like, but also it makes it easier to sell your product as well. I mean, that's the other thing. Have you any thoughts on that kind of point there, Russ, about how that, but also a little bit more generally, that environmental side, actually this is increasingly important to consumers and it's something that they're looking for?
I mean, there's no doubting it's absolutely important. It's very difficult for me to try and justify that molasses that comes from halfway around the world, you know, has the same kind of appeal as locally grown barley, right? Sugarcane does not grow in the UK. There is no getting around that. Maybe climate change will make it warm enough so it's true one day, but right now it's not. Basically, we have to source our sugarcane from other countries, and ours predominantly comes from Central America, right? And there's no way around that at the moment, as far as I know. But
do you use English molasses though, Russ, or do you?
So yeah, the sugarcane is grown in Central America and transported to Tate and Lyle. So Tate and Lyle's refinery, their molasses. So it's British molasses, yes. But the actual material, so I can't go to the farm and harvest it in any way. So that is a shame, and that's difficult to get across. But we use British molasses for that reason, that it allows us to at least keep it within the UK. Also, it gives us a really consistent product because they're extremely good at what they do. But it is a waste product, as Will said, right? It's normally cattle feed. And you can take rum out and ours still goes on to become cattle feed afterwards, right? So you just take the rum out and then they just take the waste, right? So there's a nice use of these waste materials, which otherwise, you know, would be wasted. So it's still really important to think about that every step of the way.
That's such a great story, that the fact that we talk about that a lot, you know, we take apples from local orchards, which they would typically go to feed local small holdings, or, you know, and actually you can't give, you know, we have a boar farm locally, and a lot of our grains and produce goes to them. But if you feed boar too much fruit, they get upset stomachs because of all the sugary liquid in there. Well, as a distillery, what we want is the sugary liquid. So we take the sugary liquid out, and then that goes on to feed the boar, and they absolutely love it, or it goes to anaerobic digestion. So as Russ said, we're a kind of intermediate step in the chain. I just wanted to go back, David, and just touch on one thing you said about, the story about this waste produce kind of connecting with consumers. There's a real positive and there's kind of a big negative as well, that the story is absolutely resonant with consumers. But when, I talk to farmers I work with, and, let's just say our raspberry brandy, a lot of the times the mindset and the commercial thing to do, well, just squeeze some of those raspberries and put it in a gin, and then you've got a raspberry gin. And that is the commercial thing to do. If we're fermenting raspberries and getting sweet FA yield from it, and making a really, really niche product, which, hell, I love, but it's not the commercial spirit, but it's a spirit that uses food waste. If you're juicing raspberries, you need hardly anything. But if you really want to tackle food waste, fermentation is the only way. So we're taking tons and tons of fruit produce to ferment it, to make it into brandies, whereas actually probably the commercial thing to do would be to juice it and stick it in a gin. Now, you know me, David, I'm not going to do that myself, but there is this tension between what is easy and cheap, but if you're on a mission like we are to do the sustainable thing, then there's only one answer.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I have, from that same thing, I have seen some different gins, maybe strawberry or something like that, where that's what they've used, and they've gone to use those things that would otherwise be wasted. And okay, there's still waste left after them, but I guess at least that's better than them just being chucked away completely. But yeah, as you said, the whole fermentation distillation is a more holistic approach. As we're talking so much about waste, it seems natural that we move on to our fourth point, which is waste, the leftovers from fermentation and distillation. And Will, as you've kicked off so beautifully, if you'd like to continue, please.
Well, I mean, the waste from distillation is really critical, because, I was just saying, we use a lot of raw materials and we produce a lot of waste. And to my mind, there's a couple of things that we can do with that waste. It can go to be used as feed for local smallholdings in our case, or further afield, or as feed for anaerobic digestion. So all of our stillage gets either separated into waste or solid, and goes to either feed cattle if it's or boar, or goes to anaerobic digestion. So for those people that don't know, anaerobic digesters, they produce gas for the grid. So some of the gas coming down, to heat your home, is made from anaerobic digestion, and that's where a lot of food waste goes. All the London food waste goes to anaerobic digestion, but a lot of that could be fermented. So an end goal would be to take a lot of that food waste and maybe make a clean vodka from it, for example. Just as a slight side point, because I know Chris might be interested in this, but I was down this morning at a local brewery, actually, who very similar mindset to us, and they actually take all of their spent grains and dry it, and then mill it into flour, and they sell the flour to local bakeries and pizzerias and things. So all of their grist, it doesn't go to food, it goes to food not for animals but for humans. And there's a research project in Cambridge. They also had a sample of a paper made from spent grain, which is being worked on. So quite cool.
Yeah, I've heard of a few things like that, and I guess some of it depends on your level of production as well, I guess. I know we did look at drying out the grains before, and I know there was a Scotch whiskey industry have processes of processing those grains further to make them more valuable. Currently, at our size, it's quite tricky to do that. Once you start, I guess, looking at the waste from your distillery, you kind of want to leave no stone unturned, and it becomes quite an exciting project to work through. So something we do on the gin distillation side of things is where we've finished vacuum distilling, we're left with a load of spent botanicals basically in a flask. There's still a bit of flavor in there. There's still lots of nutrients in there. So there's a couple of things we do on site which are quite cool. So one, very simply, hot compost them on site, breaks down really quickly. Then we can use that compost to grow some of next year's botanicals. So we grow basil on site. We've even had 2 harvests now of Yorkshire grown lemongrass. So we still import some from Thailand. We don't grow it all ourselves. We want to be transparent about that. But a polytunnel, global warming, you can grow lemongrass in the north of England, which is quite incredible. And we plant wildflowers. We've got beehives on site, and we use the honey in the products as well. Now, the other thing we do, which is quite exciting, which is upcycling them. So we work with a brilliant local bakery called Hatsby Bakehouse. We take those spent botanicals to them, and then they can bake them into breads. They can use them in pastry glazes, full of flavor, really nice. And then they actually end up going back to some of the restaurants that we supply the products to in the first place. So you kind of close that loop, which is, again, quite a rewarding process.
Nice. Russ?
Yeah, so I mean, I mentioned that the molasses heads off. I mean, that's kind of the bulk of what our waste products are. In terms of other waste things, I mean, the water we've covered off. It's the molasses is the bulk of what you need to worry about. We're still investigating whether there's any other added value you can get from those, rather than just. I mean, it's not like it's just giving it to cattle, because there's no waste there, but maybe there's something of even more greater value that we can do with that that waste molasses.
Yeah, rum stillage is quite tricky. It has a very high biological oxygen demand, which you don't need to worry about, but it does mean that it's very acidic, and so I've looked at various.
Means you can't put it down the drain, yeah.
Means you can't put it down the drain. But it does go in with our other waste to anaerobic digestion. I think the thing that we haven't touched on as regards waste is kind of the peripheral stuff, like boxes and packaging and shipping and things. And certainly for people that are thinking about starting a distillery and all this stuff, this is really critical. Like, if your brand mindset is we want to make the most beautiful bottle and packaging and everything, and you're not considering sustainability, you're going to end up, your brand agency is going to give you this package which looks amazing, but is completely non-recyclable, has cotton handles, single-use cotton handles, it's got plastic all over the place. They're probably going to argue the case for bioplastics, which are just as bad as regular plastics. And so, all the packaging and shipping and everything, just really think about it and take some time. Just a few examples, all of our pallets go out without any plastic, without any of that shrink plastic wrap. We're just using card, and our kind of spirits packaging it's all quite overtly recyclable. It's not really fancy or super premium, but it's kind of sending another message. So all of that kind of stuff in terms of waste. We have a bin in the distillery where we keep all of the waste that we're not recycling or we can't reuse, and we fill it, the equivalent of a black bin bag about every 6 weeks or thereabouts. And occasionally go through and do an audit of, what are we filling here? And it's an unfortunate thing about this pandemic that there's quite a lot of blue roll and face masks in there now. But that's a good way to think.
Yeah, well, that's a really good point as well. That's your, you can sing about your sustainable credentials, as we all do, and you can put it on your website and on your social media. But at the end of the day, when the product arrives at someone's home, that's the impression they're going to get of you. And so, as an example, we all our boxes we send the bottles in are basically origami made of cards, made with a local box maker just down the road. But there's and I think there's probably a whole other talk, I think, on packaging, but there's still disconnects. So you could use a carbon neutral courier, but they won't let us use the cardboard boxes. You have to use the single-use plastic inflatable thing. So, but yeah, it's definitely worth thinking about. But it's if you're kind of ahead in this, or sort of kind of leading the way, I guess, as we all are, you realize there's not all the other industries have caught up yet, like your branding agency and your couriers. And so it's often coming from us pushing up saying, this is ridiculous. Can we please change this or think about this? Challenging as always.
Yeah.
Even things like the tamper seals, I think that seems to be one of the things that I find the most annoying, just like random little bits of plastic, and then they get dropped, and particularly if you're doing some sort of tasting, you're tasting a lot of spirits or any sort of judging, and the amount of these little bits of plastic they're so easily forgotten,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, that's a really good point, David, and that goes exactly Chris's point. You know, it's not, make the decision that is sustainable. Don't just go to cost. So, you know, there are now tamper seals. We use them but they're basically cellulose tamper seals, and they come in a liquid, and you put them over your bottle. Do you guys use them?
Yeah.
Ours are paper, but yeah.
Yours are paper, okay.
Same idea.
So none of us use those plastic shrink wraps, but they come wet, so they're a little bit of a processed faff, and then they take about, I don't know, 20 minutes to shrink round. So if on a bottling run you don't have 20 minutes worth of space for them to dry and shrink around the bottle, then that's a problem. So maybe then well, we're just not going to think about that, and we'll use the heat shrink PLA or PVC one. So it's just a case of thinking about it and making the decision, which isn't like the easiest or simplest thing sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. We'll move on to talking about carbon emissions, another very important subject. Russ, would you like to kick us off with that, please?
Yeah. I mean, this is my big passion, right? I said right at the start, with a carbon negative footprint. What I mean by that is that we calculate all the CO2 emissions from the field, you know, the growing. That's why I know where the sugarcane's grown, all the way through to the customer's glass, right? So you need to think about every single step of that. And this is where it really focuses your mind on waste. I would see CO2 as a waste product, right? That we don't do enough with. And just because we can't see it and it gets chucked up into the atmosphere doesn't mean it isn't a massive problem, right? I think we're all okay with that. But the CO2 accounting, it's expensive. If you want to go and get certified to get that done, and get the just the certificate that says that you have a carbon neutral footprint, there's no negative one yet. Those are pretty pricey, and certainly if you're setting up a distillery, that's kind of daunting. My background's into CO2 research and chemistry. And so that's why I'm able to calculate it with confidence. We're still in the process of putting it up on the website to be completely transparent about that. It's very much just my scribblings at the moment and a work in progress, because it's constantly evolving, right? As we grow as a distillery, you know, there's extra bits coming in. You got to think, you know, it's not just, okay, we've grown our sugarcane, but the farm machinery that's used to drive around all of that stuff in the sugarcane fields, to the transporting of that, to the refining of the sugar to make the molasses, to, you know, delivering that molasses to the distillery here. You know, we can control the part that we think about, and that's why I say, you know, the renewable supply of energy with zero emissions associated. Actually, that's a good point, is that if you do burn biofuels, if you're doing any of that, there's CO2 emissions associated with all of that. So, you know, we would argue that isn't good enough, and that you really need to focus your mind on CO2 as a waste product, right? It could have come under that waste section, but it is a big problem. It isn't currently taxed, so, you know, it's not a business decision, right? That's what we've been talking about all the way through here. Really, it's not something that's you're not driven to make that choice. You have to want to do it at the moment, but that will change, and you definitely need to be in a position that you're ready to adapt to that. Yeah, that's kind of our thinking.
Russ, just for people that are not familiar, and if it is possible to briefly give an overview, what's the thing that makes the distillery, rather than being neutral, negative in your particular case?
So within that entire calculation, you can assign basically you average it out. So you have a number of how much CO2 it takes to make a bottle of rum. And then we would offset more CO2 than it takes to make all of that. And by offset, I mean, you know, you've got options like planting trees, and there are other technologies as well. The one that we go for is it's called direct air capture. So it's a partnership with a company in Switzerland. They're called Climeworks. They basically sucking CO2 straight out of the atmosphere with a giant machine that looks a bit like a air conditioning unit, and that's filtering CO2 out of the air. It then goes through a process that converts it into stone, and then it's stored underground. Generally, they fill up old mines, so old places where we've dug up stuff and we've got spaces for them, and then we can backfill that with all of this CO2. So it locks it out of the atmosphere. and stores it back underground. Well, you know, because all we did was dig up the oil and burn it, right? So we're just putting it back.
So it's very much this partnership with these other companies doing these other products and supporting them. That thing that's.
Now that's a very expensive technology, right?
Yeah,
and this is not a sensible way to do it, and that's not the point of the whole thing, right? It does add a cost to each bottle. The real challenge for us is that I think most consumers, unfortunately, won't buy your product simply because of that, right? You need to offer, and these guys all here, you know, do the same. You need to offer a great product first, right? That's what matters. Care about the product first, and then all of this other stuff, you'll get the message across from there. Yeah, really crucial.
I think that point you made, Russ, is absolutely key when it comes to the carbon neutral or carbon negative, however you want to phrase it, because what I came to the conclusion pretty quickly that saying carbon neutral negative is such a good way to engage customers. Like we've just spent 45 minutes talking about all the minutiae of being sustainable within a distillery that we're all super nerdy about, but we would have lost your average consumer like 30 seconds in, right? So how do you wrap all this stuff up into something that the consumer's going to go, I totally get that? And for me, carbon neutral, we use the term carbon neutral, but is a really good way of doing that. And Russ is absolutely bang on that the calculation is a little bit fiendish, and you've got to really understand really, really well all of your inputs and everything. Now, we have to make some broad brush assumptions when it comes to, you know, certain things we do, and we feel that that's acceptable, and we're kind of transparent about where we've made those. One thing we haven't done, and our carbon neutral assessment is on our website, is we've stated in that carbon neutral assessment that we haven't incorporated the CO2 which is given off during fermentations, just because we wanted to get that done, and we didn't have the time to kind of figure out. And I've kind of gone back and now looked at that, and it's such a small fraction of our entire carbon budget, but so we'll incorporate that in the next revision. But I think that marketing element is quite important to me, and I certainly hear that reflected back to me from consumers who talk about carbon negative and carbon neutral brands.
Absolutely. To sort of add to that as well, and you know, we have a couple of schemes running here at the distillery that have do really engage customers, and it does get you attention maybe bigger than you potentially would if you weren't doing them. So, you know, national press coverage, etc., through some of those things. So carbon negative or climate positive is a phrase sometimes used as well, which people seem to like. So as an example, here we do tree planting. So we've partnered with the Yorkshire Dales Millennium Trust, the local charity. So every bottle of gin we sell, we plant 1 square metre of native English woodland in the Yorkshire Dales on our doorstep. We go and plant with a charity. It's a very simple thing to understand. And as Will said, if we had talked about 40 minutes to some of our customers about our you know, heat recovery, we're going to lose them. But if it's like, I buy this bottle, I plant 1 square metre of woodland, I know where that woodland is. Brilliant. You've got it in a nutshell. And even if that's the only thing they grasp, someone grasps that's fantastic. And it is making a difference. Another scheme we run here, which is relatively low impact, but in terms of consumer engagement, we've found ridiculously high, and that is a refill scheme. And I know we've spoken to Will about this before. So if people buy a bottle of our gin, wherever they buy it from, if they bring it back to the distillery empty, we can refill it for them, and they save, it's about £6 off a bottle. So carbon wise, it's a relatively small impact, but in terms of encouraging people to reuse, recycle, to get involved with the ethos and sort of get behind what we're doing, it's so good. And we've seen such a huge increase in the number of people coming back to the distillery purely to refill their bottle, and sort of almost proud that they've refilled it 7 times now. And there's simple little things like that, which are kind of the thin end of the wedge, if that's the right term, that it's just capturing people's imagination. And then kind of once you've got them hooked to that refill, you'll be like, oh, did you know we do this? And come and have a look at this carbon, this heat recovery thing we've got here. You sort of reel them in from that point onwards.
It's an interesting point, and I think this is something that I often hear when discussing sustainability and environmental issues. And I'm putting Chris on a little bit on the spot here, so apologies. But so like, and unfortunately not yet come to visit the distillery. I was hoping maybe to come this year, but it might be next year now. But so depending on where a distillery was, though, one of the things that someone might say is, but if someone's got to drive to your distillery, if they've got to drive to your distillery to refill it, then there's like, well, how much does that offset the benefit of the refill? And I'm picking on you a little bit, so my apologies. But the point more is, this is something that I see a lot in this general discussion, is how different things, this trade-off between things. So I've seen like some people from a packaging point of view selling gin in like the plastic pouches or whatever, these sort of pouches. So much lighter, much easier to ship, both in terms of the bottles and stuff. But there's an issue, because what do you do with the plastic afterwards?
Yeah.
Correct.
And it's like, so then there's this kind of question. So what's better, to save the energy and everything of making the bottle and then the carbon of shifting that around and everything, or it's just a difficult balance.
But that's what I and Abs personally love. It's like, right, we've got a conundrum, we've got a good idea, we've got people refilling, but people are driving. Where are they coming from? So it's about understanding where those people are coming from, understanding the distance they're traveling, how they're getting here. Even we start incentivizing people arriving on bike, and we had someone recently with big 3 refills in his cycling top. It was amazing. So it's about understanding that and then making an informed decision. And we're at the moment going through a carbon assessment of our products, including the refill scheme, and understanding that. And the pouches, I saw Russ shaking his head there as well. We looked into them, and just I can't. Single-use, anything that's introducing single-use plastics is not. There's better ways of doing things. That's gone. So yeah, we're 100% against those. But yeah, no, absolutely, it is a good point. And you have the data, you collect the data in the first place, you make the time to analyze it, and that's how you always driven by the data and making sure what you're doing is having a positive impact.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the glass bottle itself is probably one of the biggest contributors of CO2 that the distillery has, right? Certainly in my calculation, it's enormous, maybe 30%, something like that. And that's simply because glass isn't recycled well enough, right? So this reusing it probably would easily offset any driving around by any people, simply because you've basically just eliminated that CO2 cost. There's no way driving is as bad as that, because the energy to make the glass is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah, David, I think that from my point of view, for me, sustainability is different from everything else we do in a distillery, because everything else we do in this distillery, we're a little bit cagey about it. There's some secret sauce, recipe development, all that kind of stuff. And we're like, we talk about the surface presentation layer, but it's important that some of that is protected. With the sustainability issues, everybody has to do it. All us 3 guys and gals that are running, that are out in front, we have to share everything we know, because it's important that everyone comes along. And I think the enemy of, sustainable, communication and people embracing it is like a dogmatic approach. And you've really got to think about what is the intent here? If we say, well, let's think about that strawberry gin you were mentioning. Well, if the brand is talking about strawberry gin and the strawberries are made from surplus, let's say, but the gin in the bottle is made by burning, diesel or coal, and the spirit is produced in an unenvironmentally and shipped in an unenvironmentally way with a huge, great kind of plastic single-use cork or something, then what's the point? But the intent behind it is to, maybe not, but the intent behind it is to communicate an idea and an ideal. And I think that's the same with someone, driving to a distillery to refill the bottle. They are proud, and they are drinking it down, the kind of sustainability intent of what they're doing. And they will go off and they will, for the next 3 dinner parties, they will convince their friends to think more sustainably. And so, it's appropriate that us who run distilleries, we think about the entire net benefit of each decision we make. But when we ask people to join us on this journey, let's not demand that of them straight away.
So yeah, that's a really good point. And actually, I'll ask another quick question, just because the 30% thing about the carbon and the bottles for us is like, that's such a nice, neat, that's why I said it again, thing to come and take away. So it begs the question, with a lot of premium tonics, a lot of them come in glass bottles. And if anyone's had to lug those to the bottle bank, there's a significant, I mean, if that's how much carbon is from glass as opposed to cans or something like that.
It's much better to use cans, yeah.
Never hear anyone talk about it though. Never hear anyone talk about it. So I mean, at home, I don't have glass bottles anymore. It's all cans. If you don't do it in little cans, that's where I don't have eggs in my fridge. I have cans. If you don't do it in little cans, then we're not going to have it because it just seems daft to me and just not sustainable anyway. So anyway, that was just a side point because it's a pet peeve.
I mean, it's a really important one. But if recycling of glass were 100%, right? If everyone recycled all their glass all the time, glass would definitely be the best option. Definitely, because the amount of mining energy that's required to turn the aluminium into a can is massive, but it's recycled so much better.
Yeah,
and that's the crucial difference, right? So it is possible to make it better.
There's also sorry, Russ, didn't mean to interrupt there. There's also the weight of the bottle in the first place, and there is a tendency in premium spirits to use bottles with, you know, an inch thick glass base that weighs 1.5 kilos. You can easily do like we do, an off-the-shelf bottle that weighs, I think I was about 300 grams on average less. So talk about if it's, you know, Russ was saying 30% of your impact, and then you're reducing that by another 20% by using a lighter weight glass bottle. Yes, it might not feel as premium, but we've got to move away from something being premium just needs to be heavy and energy intensive and you know, feel weighty. There's much more ways to convey premium, and if you're having to rely on a heavy glass bottle, then you've got some work to do.
Yeah, well, I think so. I think in their last redesign, I think it was 30% of the weight that Gordon's took out of their bottle for the redesign. You think about how much of that is shipped around the place.
I mean, financially, that makes sense as well.
And financially. But I mean, that's the thing, right? And I guess another point is some of this stuff, you do it because it's the responsible thing to do. But also some of this, it's not all about all of this is just going to cost me more money. There is some of this does financially make sense as well. The example of the weight of the bottle, saving on material, making the bottle and the shipping and stuff, I think it can easily be both. So
it doesn't cost more. Those little capsules, you know, the shrink wrap capsules, the cellulose, plant cellulose, completely compostable, completely biodegradable, cost exactly the same. So
there's added benefits as well. There's lots of benefits you can't cost. So we're talking to someone. So we're part of the Circular Yorkshire, so circular economy up here. And speaking to someone recently about that, and they're asking about other benefits other than financial. And there's things. One of the biggest things that came out of it was the coverage you get and the people writing about you and wanting to speak to you because of what you're doing is different. And maybe in 5 years, hopefully it isn't so different. And this panel will consist of most of the distilling industry. That would be great. But also there's things like the team, the people it attracts. You know, we have people coming, wanting to work for us. Like these guys, we're a really good product, but because of that sustainable ethos and those sort of things you can't cost. And it's only a few years down the line, you're like, crikey, we've got some really good people around us. We're doing some really interesting things, collaborating with some fantastic people. And that is partly born out of that ethos that underpins everything you do. And I'm sure the guys would agree, there's been lots of things in their business that's taken unusual but very positive directions born out of this sustainable ethos, but probably wasn't in the original business plan and isn't on the cash flow anywhere either.
I'd agree.
So just on a kind of our last point, and this kind of fits nicely, talking about kind of the wider community, which Chris has started to talk about, and sort of environmental impact and things like that. Just taking a more wider view. It's a bit woolly, I know, but it's kind of just to kind of finish off the discussion. Sorry. So, well, for that, look, Russ, you can go first.
That's good. The wider community. I mean, it does, exactly as Chris says, it does really attract a different kind of media attention. It really captures a certain group's imagination, and it certainly opens doors that would otherwise be closed. If you're not sustainably minded, I think, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? You can't just be in it. If you're in it for a quick buck, then this is probably the wrong game, right? You need to have that kind of edge, and yeah, it would close doors. I'm sure it would close doors for investment, for media, if you just didn't care. You just didn't care. So I think every company now pretty much has some sort of sustainability thing, whether it's at the forefront of their mind, as it is with us, No, probably not. And that's the part that will probably change over the next few years. Is that we're driving forward change within attitudes, I guess. But the wider community is starting to care more, for sure.
Definitely, I'd say people, consumers are beginning to look further at, the products they buy and the companies behind them and how they're behaving. And we've all touched on it here. Is that sort of honesty, transparency, and putting on your website, publishing those reports. And also, I'd guess to anyone else sort of starting out in it is to be aware that you're not going to get everything right first pass. And I'm sure all of us have got things we want to improve on. We've all slightly touched on them. There's things we're not doing perfectly yet, but we're aware of that. We've got it, and we're trying to find ways to improve. And I think consumers appreciate that as well. And as do the press, as do your trade partners. Everyone appreciates that honesty. And if your heart's in the right place and you are making an impact, but aware there's always more to do. And I know the three of us, the work's never going to be done, unfortunately. If we can bring more people involved in other distilleries and more members of the public and all, get them as excited about it as we are, then that's a good thing.
And Will, any thoughts, or unless we're just wrapping up, any other final thoughts as well, Rob?
I mean, I've definitely seen a change in the distilling community over the last few years. When this was a kind of twinkle in my eye, it was really, consumers, I don't think looked at premium spirits with sustainability in mind at all. And that has changed. And, the biggest brands, see the work that Diageo are doing on bottles and things like that. That change doesn't happen without consumers driving it. So this change is really happening. All distilleries are going to have to adapt to that and become more sustainable, which is great. And I think anyone that's watching this thinking about starting a distillery, or even more than that, they're thinking about their distillery and how do they brand it as sustainable. My advice would be, don't look around your distillery to find sustainable things and then talk about how sustainable you are, because it can all fall apart if it isn't a genuine mission. So much better to take your customers on a journey, communicate to your customers what you want to do in the next 6 months, and then show them 6 months later what you've done. And that, for me, that is a way of engaging with your customers that drips in authenticity, and actually it holds you to account. You can't say to your customers 6 months down the line, we want to swap our gas boiler for an electric boiler and use green energy, and then just go quiet on it. So I think that for me, that's the thing, is any distillery can do. Every distillery wants to take their customers on a journey, and one of the easiest ways to do that is sustainability.
Chris, Russ, any final thoughts?
That kind of sums it up really nicely. It is the entire focus. This is, if you can take your customer on a journey, then that's how you sell it. It's the same with the whole story needs to be, but it needs to be genuine. You really need to get that passion across. If you don't care about it yourself, everyone's going to see through it immediately, right? It has to be from the heart. Yeah. I guess
that what we're all saying is, I guess there's a vision there, isn't there? There's a why, there's a reason to exist. And if sustainability is underpinning what you're doing, then you're honest about and you promote that, then you will do well and it will come across, and it is authentic. There's one TED talk by a chap called Simon Sinek. I don't know if you guys have watched it, but anyone wanting to start a distillery, it's called Why. And it's basically, if you start with your why and your reason to exist and your vision, then everything else pans out from there. And in all honesty, it's a very wholesome way of doing business. And all of us have been here smiling for the last 45 minutes. Not too many grey hairs in sight. So obviously something's working.
That's the
That's brilliant. Well, I want to thank my panelists. It's been really, really interesting. It's something I've been really keen on for a long time, but I've learned a lot of stuff today. Thank you very much for listening, the audience. We're going to have a live Q&A session on Friday, the 16th of October at noon. If you've got any questions, come on to that. You can type them in. We can answer them. Well, I'm not going to be answering, but panels have to be answering them if you want a proper answer. But once again, thanks everyone, and I'll see you all soon. Bye.
Thank you very much. See you.